I'm David Groninger. Made a few mistakes there, but that's a part of life. Not trying to get everything perfect, but just enjoying the process, enjoying the energy of it, despite the fact of there being a little bit of imperfection here and there. Well, I've got an interesting idea to express, and I call it the idea of the good landlord. And by good landlord, I just mean that I've known a few people who have been landlords that really did a great job for their tenants. One was our next door neighbor when I was growing up. His name was Huey Littlejohn. Well, we lived in a house that had, I guess, about 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and I had 3 siblings, and my mom and dad, and this is in the early 1960s. So this guy who lived next door, who was the landlord, who owned his own house next door too, he rented this house to my dad for $100 a month. $100 a month. Now that was in the year 1960, and he also told my dad that he would sell him the house if he wanted to buy it for just $10,000, maybe a little bit less than maybe that he could have got from somewhere else. But either way, even up until the year 1970, when we moved out of that house and moved up into the north part of Seattle, into Lake City, the Huey Littlejohn told my dad that he would sell him the house for $20,000. So he was a nice guy, and even up until that time, he wasn't asking very much for rent, because he knew my dad was, had just gotten started in life. That is in 1960. My mother was going to college, and they were raising 4 kids. So he was very compassionate toward his tenants, and my dad took excellent care of the place and did a lot of maintenance things. Well, anyway, incidentally, that house, I just recently saw it valued at $980,000. $980,000. And here this guy, Huey Littlejohn, very, very ethical, kind human being, would have sold it to my dad for $20,000 in 1970, but my dad, he wanted to buy a house in Lake City. Well, I always thought that's kind of nice when people, they could charge more money for rent, but instead they look at the person's situation, they see that the people in the house are doing something to create value for themselves or for their families. So the person who owns that property decides, I'm going to support this person who's creating value by charging less rent to enable them to use the money for education or other things. Well, I knew another guy who happened to be my next door neighbor in the house I live in right now, actually. He passed away about 10 years ago. But I recall he owned 3 houses in North Seattle, that he had purchased in the early 1960s. And he bought them so that he would will each one to each one of his 3 kids. Well, anyway, I recall even in the year like 2006 or 2007, this guy, his name was Frank, very wonderful human being. He was telling me about the tenants he had in these houses. And he told me that this one house, it was a 3-bedroom house, that it was a husband and wife who were going to medical school at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And he told me that he was renting them this house for $350 a month. Yeah, he was renting a house, 3-bedroom house, in a nice area of Greenwood, I believe, for $350 a month. Now, he could have obtained a lot more money for that, but he explained to me, he said, you know what, these people are going to medical school, they have to pay their own way through school, and they have to pay all their expenses, and he said, if I can help them out by not charging them so much rent, and he even told me that even the $350 a month covers all of his property taxes and every one of his expenses that he could have on the house anyway for the year, and so he felt like that was fair enough. So he told me that because he could help these people out, if it allowed them to finish medical school sooner, because they didn't have to make a lot of extra money and work extra jobs or whatever, or because they could spend more time studying rather than working to pay expensive rent. He thought that would be doing something good for others because the world would have 2 doctors sooner. And I thought, that was really nice. And he had this other house that he told me he was renting for $450 a month, like a 3-bedroom house, nice home. So here again, where other people are renting houses for, even in 2006, $2,000 a month, $1,500 a month, $1,700 a month, whatever. Here, $450 a month. And he told me it was because it was for a single mother and her 2 kids. And he said, these single mothers, they have to work hard and they have to raise some kids. And he felt like it was a good investment for the community. If she didn't have to pay so much, she could have more money to help out pay for either education or things that her kids might need. So I just remember that I have these 2 memories of 2 really outstanding landlords. So I call them the good landlords. And it's kind of sad that both of them have long since left the earth. Huey Littlejohn, I think, died in the late 70s. And Frank, my next door neighbor, passed away about 9 or 10 years ago. Well, it made me, I thought of these things when a friend of mine and his girlfriend have been renting this house right here in Lake City for the last 20 years. And they've spent, I think they rented it for like $1,700 a month. Well, just because over the last couple of years, housing prices increased so dramatically in Seattle because of a lot of the good economics of the high-tech companies all through Seattle, a lot of positive things about the housing market in Seattle, if you call increasing prices positive. Well, let me say a lot of positive things about the employment market, which then affected the housing market by causing, prices to rise. Well, so this landlord who had these tenants, my 2 good friends, for 20 years they were paying $1,700 a month. In that amount of rent, they would have, paid for the whole house. they would have probably more than paid the entire price this guy originally paid for the house. Well, anyway, so we decided to increase the rent to $2,500 a month. He said, well, I could get $2,500 from somebody else, so it's now $2,500, and if you can't pay that, you'll just have to leave. So these people were rather distraught about that. They had been there for 20 years. Their rent helped him pay off the total amount of money he paid for the house. And now his house is worth $500,000 or so, or maybe a little more. So here's this person who's had all this increase of equity of his house for reasons that he had nothing to do with other than just it was the Seattle employment market was doing so well. And instead of celebrating this, instead of maybe allowing the tenants to stay there even for a lesser price or even for the same, he decided that because he could get more from somebody else that he would increase the rent. So this put a hardship on these people. So I always thought, I wonder, is that really a nice thing to do? Well, I know another guy who had this apartment right behind the Bill Pierre car dealership here in Seattle. There's a row of apartments there. Well, he was paying $900 a month for like a 3-bedroom, and he was there for like 15, 17 years. And so because of, again, housing prices going up, the landlord said, okay, your rent's now $1,700. So they raised the rent in just 1 month, or maybe they gave him a couple months' notice, from $900 to $1,700, because they said they could get that from other people. So they decided, well, that's your increase. So now it forced him to find another place to live too. So I look at these examples of people who they own the property, they own the land, and these other tenants have paid so much money toward their equity and have helped the owners become so much wealthier. And a lot of this wealth that the owners have has nothing to do with their own intelligence, labor, ethical conduct, or contribution in any way. It's just that they happen to be the owners of a plot of land, and then the employment marketplace did so well that now the property is worth a lot. So instead of being kind to the tenants, they raise the rent that much. It reminds me of the history, because when you think about a landlord and the word lord, in the feudal Europe situation, feudal Europe, in the Middle Ages or whatever, they had these lords and the serfs. The lords owned the land, and the serfs could farm the land, and they would pay a certain amount of their crops, maybe half, 30%, whatever, in rent. So in 1620, when the Pilgrims came to, America, and when other people came from Europe to America, they were trying to get away from the system where they could never own land. They wanted to be in a place where they could own land. So you have these pilgrims that come, to Massachusetts in 1620, and now they can own land. So the idea of the American dream, or the idea of freedom in the New World, was the ability to own land, to have the results of your own productivity, for you to have that, rather than to just be forced to pay 50% or more of your productivity to somebody else just because they were there before you were. Well, in a way, it almost seems like that America is reverting back to the feudal days again, the feudal system, where you have the landlords and the people that cannot afford to buy property, because the people that have the money buy it up, and such. And it doesn't seem much like the golden rule is much respected. Do unto others as you would like done unto you. Because I wonder if these landlords would they really appreciate it if they themselves were in a situation like my friends with paying $1,700 for the house each month, and what if he was paying $1,700 and somebody said, okay, now we're going to raise your rent to $2,500? Would he like that? I would say, maybe not. Yet the doing unto others has become a neglectful kind of a thing. Instead, it seems like greed and the monetary aspect has more of an importance than kindness toward human beings. So I say this to remember the good landlords I've known. Huey Littlejohn, who rented this house in the Montlake district, in a beautiful home, for $100 a month. Of course, this is in the 1960, when that's kind of what things were going for. But still, it was less than the market would demand. And then even in 1970, he would have rented it. The rent was still only $200 a month. Then I'm also reminded of my neighbor Frank, who would rent a house for $350 a month. This other one for $400 a month. This other one, I think, for like $525 a month. And also, he told me that once in a while the people were late on the rent, but he said he didn't really mind it, because as long as they paid a few months later and paid it, it was okay for him, because as long as every 6 months he had the money to pay the property taxes, that was fine. So he never got on their case for even being late on the rent. So think about this. There can be some really, really good people in this world. And if you are a tenant, and if you have to pay such high price for your rent just to own a little piece just to occupy a space, seek out and find people who are good landlords, who will give you a break on the price because you're doing something good with your life. People who understand that there can be a win-win situation, and not to try to make people into slaves again like the lords and the serf system, but who respect the idea that everybody can be free, and that even tenants can enjoy freedom by being treated fairly in having a fair rent to pay, rather than the highest that the market can demand. So that's my message. If you're a tenant, seek out the good landlords. And if you're a good landlord, realize that you have a choice to make a great contribution to the community by being very, very fair, even extra fair, to tenants. And that's my speech for today. This is David Groninger in Seattle, Washington. This piece I played before was the first couple pages of one of my favorite pieces by Rachmaninoff, Prelude in G minor. It energizes me, so I play a piano piece before giving a talk. So this is David Groninger, having given a talk called The Good Landlord in Seattle, Washington on November 14th, 2016. Thank you.